What's up, Coach TJ?
Hello, welcome back to the microcast.
Yeah, before we get too deep into the podcast, I have a quick announcement. My new podcast in collaboration with Coach Kylie here at Microcosm Coaching is live. It's called Your Diet Sucks, and it is all about nutrition, performance, diet culture, and how those things intersect. So if you are a fan of nutrition science, food science, if you like to geek out about fueling and how to improve your performance in sport through fueling, or if you're someone who's just trying to have a healthier and happier relationship with your body, I would highly recommend checking it out. Do me a favor and hit subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And if you like it, share it with a friend.
It's good stuff, Zoe.
Did you like it?
I have. I've listened to 4 or 5 episodes already.
Yeah.
I don't know if all of those have been released to the public.
No, just you.
Special me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do enjoy it, actually. I love the perspective, the history on some of these really prevalent diets. I think especially for endurance athletes, some of the stuff that we hear out there in the running space around, diet hacks that certain what do you call them, influencers are promoting out there. I love just hearing about kind of the nuts and bolts of those diets and if they actually work or not, and just getting into that science. And also Kylie offers some really great case studies as well. So I think that those are super interesting, will be interesting for people.
Yeah, well, it's been pumped to share. We've been really pumped to share it with the world. Again, just hit like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and share it with a friend. All right, Coach TJ, time for some hot or nots. We're going to try to do this pretty quick because we have a lot to get through today. Actually, let me share a roadmap with what we're going to do.
Yeah, what are we getting into here?
We're going to do some hot or nots. Then we're going to do a little Ask the Coach corner where we're going to field some questions that we've gotten from athletes. We're going to do a partner race swap and talk about my training for Leadville. You made a recent coaching change, so we're going to get a little bit into what athletes should look for in a coach. And then we're going to talk about a really cool study that looks at the difference between elite and non-elite trail runners. And then we're going to talk about the six biggest training mistakes that athletes make. So a lot of cool stuff to talk through today and a lot of important takeaways for athletes of every level.
Oh my God, this is a huge podcast.
Huge.
I'm glad I'm carved up right now.
Yeah. All right, TJ, hot or not, dried fruit.
Not hot.
Yeah, same. Dried fruit, not really ideal as an endurance fuel. So we always want to be thinking about the fact that, so our body can use glucose and fructose, breaking that down for fuel, but it can't break down as much fructose as glucose. And fructose is the sugar that is most often found in fruit and dried fruit. So if you're inundating your system with more fructose than glucose, it's less efficient, and there's sort of like less pathways that fructose can get through. It's less easy for your body to break it down. So you're like, the ratio of fuel isn't going to be as good. If you look at most like fuel sources that you get out on the market, there's usually a mix of fructose and glucose in like most sports performance fuel. And that's really what athletes want to be aiming for. Dried fruit, a little bit too much fructose and a lot of fiber, just not the most effective fueling for athletes.
Oh, just sounds rubbery and hard to
Sounds
eat.
really dry. Maybe if you're going on it's a great snack, but I would not recommend it as
It's like a hiking
an endurance
snack.
fuel. It's a hiking snack.
Yeah, a little nut in there, maybe a little M&M, and you've got, what do you call that?
Then you have
trail mix?
like the holy trinity of like bad fuel. Not bad, like again, like these foods are great for snacks, but fats, proteins, not as easily broken down by your body for fuel.
The holy trinity of GI distress.
Correct. Yes.
You almost said something funny.
Yeah. Drop bags, TJ, hot or not?
Very hot if you don't have crew.
Yeah. I would even say a lot of times in races that have a combination of crew and drop bags.
Oh, like a run rabbit?
Yeah. I like them because you don't have to carry as much stuff. So I think that it's always about making sure that you dial in your drop bags. You have a strategy. You don't want to put too much stuff in there. You don't want to have like emotional support I don't know, shoes in there. Like, you got to make sure you're really intentional with everything that goes in. But I am definitely a fan of using drop bags during races.
Yep. Don't carry all your stuff if you don't have to. Lighten that load. It just makes racing so much more fun.
Agreed. All right. Hot or not, Body Glide.
Super hot.
Same. Super hot. I used to feel bad. There were parts of my body that touched and rubbed and resulted in chafing. It's actually just a normal part of being a human, and most people experience that at some point. So do yourself a favor and lube those areas up.
I just want to go out on the record as saying athletes should put Body Glide on their feet to prevent blisters.
Mm-hmm.
I think
How do you use Body Glide on your feet?
I put it all over my feet, any areas that in the past maybe I've had a little bit of blisters or calluses, because those are typically kind of the high rub spots. I have not, since I've started putting Body Glide on my feet, I have not had a single blister, and that includes doing 200s.
Wow.
So highly recommend it.
Yeah.
And those 100s were wet, which is typically when, your feet get wet, they get soft. And so those calluses aren't as protective, and that's when really bad blisters can happen.
Your skin swells, resulting in the ability, like, in more friction, essentially.
So put that on your feet too.
Yeah, I also am Body Glide is different than a lot of times at aid stations. You'll see Vaseline. I don't really recommend using Vaseline unless it's like a total emergency, because Body Glide is formulated in such a way that there is like the ability to lose moisture through it. Vaseline will trap moisture in, which can a lot of times put you sort of like in a worse spot than where you started.
Okay.
Yep. All right.
I'm warmed up.
You're lubed up for this one.
I'm lubed up right now. Let's ask the coach.
Yeah. So this is a question that we get a lot for athletes training for 100-mile races or just longer events generally. How do you train to run at night, Coach TJ?
How do I do it? I don't do it.
Yeah, that's my approach as well.
I do think that honestly, what I advocate with for my athletes is 1 to 2 long runs that happen within the build. You pre-plan these. They are sometimes I'm involved in that planning process with the athlete. Usually not. Usually the athlete just does it on their own. But this should be sometime during the build where you start your long run. Can be the Saturday long run or maybe the back-to-back long run, typically Saturday or Sunday. One of those runs, once or twice in a build, can be in the evening. And start that, maybe around dusk. That way you spend 60 to 90 minutes in the dark with a headlamp on. It's typical that athletes run slower in the dark. They feel like they're like less agile. So it does help to get used to it a little bit, but this doesn't have to be something that you train too specifically for. Having a little caffeine strategy going into night sessions in a race is a good idea, although I wouldn't advocate for trying that on any
in training.
long runs because it would.
You don't need to get jacked up after your long run and then set your recovery back.
Right. And then I think like sometimes there's like gear stuff like headlamps and things like that. Like you should be able to work that out over 1 to 2 runs where you spend an hour to 90 or so minutes in the dark finding a headlamp, waist lamp, whatever your preferred method is, but just finding out what that is like. And because that, it always feels a little different when you're out there on the race. So you don't want to try like anything new on race day. And obviously, like probably the number one thing is just don't obsess about it.
Yeah.
Like this is pretty low hanging fruit. Be prepared to feel tired at night. Be prepared to use caffeine to help with that. A lot of, positive self-talk, motivational self-talk for those sections. It's something that I think, you could like rehearse with visualization probably would be more effective than spending more than 1 or 2 long runs working on it in a build.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. There was Killian Jornet had like a legendary Instagram story like 5 years ago. He was out training. He went out like at midnight to train for UTMB, but with Killian, like those marginal gains are really critical for folks who like are trying to win UTMB versus a weekend warrior type person. But since he was like driving around the Spanish countryside at like 2 a.m., he got pulled over by the police and they were like, "Why are you out here driving?" He's like, "No, I swear, like I'm just out here to train."
Yeah.
And I think that's really funny. But my strategy is usually I end up pacing you or someone else at a race where I get to practice running at night, and that's all I do. I think that running at night is something that people tend to over index on, and I think that not focusing on it so much would be helpful. I tend to run in the dark a little bit, like in winter, just as part of like normal training. Sometimes my runs are at night, and I think that's the case for a lot of athletes that train while having jobs. But I definitely wouldn't go out of your way to like run at midnight just to see how that feels, or run at 2 a.m. just to see how that feels, because the trade-off of like your diminished recovery is going to be not that positive. So I think this is one of those things where like, do it once, but it definitely doesn't need to be a huge part of your training.
Yep. Agreed.
All right, TJ, here is another athlete question.
Okay.
My last couple long runs, I've been getting salt on my skin. A Google search has quickly explained why this is happening, but I can't find one clear answer. Does this mean I need more or less electrolytes? I think it might be counterintuitive and I might need more, but I'm just not sure. What do you think?
If you're just not sure, which is every single athlete out there who's never done a sweat test, get a sweat test.
Get a sweat test.
If you haven't done a sweat test, you're just guessing.
Yeah. And looking at the salt on your clothes is not an accurate way of gauging how much salt you lose. Best case scenario, it can tell you are on the salty side, but that could mean you lose anywhere from 500 to 1,200 milligrams of sodium an hour. So it doesn't do anything to actually help you dial this in. And like seeing salt on your clothes depends on a lot of totally unhelpful factors, like was it humid, and that's going to mean the salt stays in your clothes, like stays visibly on your clothes longer. How dark are your clothes? Did you splash yourself with water along the run? Looking at salt on your vest, hat, whatever is not an accurate way of gauging what your electrolyte loss rate, and the only way to know how many milligrams of sodium you lose an hour is to get a sweat test. I can't recommend this to athletes enough. Don't take an online quiz that says you're this salty. You need to get tested by a professional like Precision Hydration or Levelin to really dial things in. Seeing salt on your shorts isn't helpful if you don't know how much salt is there, right? Like if every recipe you ever read just said some salt, you'd be like, is that a pinch? Is that a cup? Like, what does that mean? So again, this is not an accurate way of gauging what your electrolyte loss rates are. And this is something that we see is hugely, hugely, hugely individual. It's primarily actually genetically determined. So make sure that you work with a professional to dial in your electrolyte loss rate, and looking at your hat is not a professional.
Yeah, totally. And I just can't say enough good things about having done this testing for myself, and also really strongly advocating it for the athletes that I coach. This is going to really help to change your performance outcomes. It's going to improve your training, and it's going to improve your racing.
Yeah, and it's tough because the symptoms of getting too much salt and getting too little look really, really similar. So again, really the only answer here is to spend the $200 and get that test. That may seem like a lot of money on paper, but when you're able to not waste money on nutrition products that don't work for you, and if it can save you a DNF or save you a lot of pain down the road, then it's definitely worth it.
100%.
All right, next question, Coach TJ. I'm using poles while running makes one of my hips hurt. Any advice? And should they be used on the flats too? I tend to use them the entire time when running with them.
Well, wow.
A lot going on there.
Okay. My hip hurts. I'm curious if that's just when using poles or not. My experience as a coach says probably that hip's hurting, regardless of whether the athlete's using the poles or not.
I wonder if using the poles might actually cause them to adopt running form where they don't have as good a forward lean, meaning their glutes are inactive, and having lazy or weak glutes can definitely cause hip issues. I really recommend using a resistance band 2 to 5 times a week, or like doing clamshells to strengthen your hips.
Okay,
a lot of times. Right. No, this is important.
It is, but I do think like that's like almost a separate, like we could just do a whole separate podcast on that. Well, I feel like you hit the right point though, which is why I want to stop you before we go too much in the weeds. The poles could actually be messing with this athlete's
Definitely.
running
Can
form.
you can't have a strong forward lean if you're holding poles while going upright on the flats.
Well, I was also
And
thinking
that's
you
going
could
to be
have
really biomechanically and really energetically inefficient.
you could have way too much forward lean, or you could have very poor posture, hip,
Yeah.
shoulder, head, neck alignment could be way off as a result of trying to use those poles on the flats. Poles are meant to be used uphill where you're closer to the gradient, so the length of the pole makes a lot more sense on
Right.
steep terrain. And you get poles when you're fitted for poles. You're fitted with them because they're meant to be used on the uphill. They're not
Right.
fitted to be used on downhills, and they're not fitted to be used on flats. So yeah, I think you hit it right. Like, this is just going to impact your form. How it's impacting your form is going to be different for every runner. So probably the first thing to do is just stop running with those poles out when you're going on flats and downhills. The poles are really meant to help you on the ups.
Yeah.
I think, like, if it's just also pretty inefficient to use
Super
poles on
inefficient.
the flats and the downs.
Yeah, because the way it's going to make you swing your arms and the amount of force that you're going to have to put into them to get any positive forward locomotive benefit is just going to be diminished by how much energy you have to expend to do so. That trade-off becomes more beneficial on the steeps though, right? Like, yes, you're using slightly more energy in a slightly different way, but the mechanical benefit is such that it's worth the trade-off on steeper grades. We don't recommend running with poles on the flats or the downhills. We recommend if you feel that you need a pole to be more efficient in those places, likely it means you should just be targeting those weaknesses and training more by focusing on running your downhills more strongly in training, and doing things like speed workouts to become more efficient on the flats. I did find a study that showed that using poles on flats does reduce impact forces, but that's a really marginal trade-off. And thinking about, like, well, what helps you actually adapt to those impact forces? Training effectively long term.
I'm curious, just one caveat to this. Maybe a race like a Hard Rock, where I can imagine you're coming down Handies and it's extremely steep,
Yeah.
or you're descending down to Island Lake, very, very steep.
Sure.
If for those brief moments, having the poles out and having those 4 points of contact could be
Yes.
helpful for athletes.
So poles are useful on the downhills when you want to use them to arrest your momentum.
Oh, so when you're not running.
So when you're not running. So, like, yes, there are times where having those points of contact are helpful, but when the goal is to reduce your speed, that's when they come into play. Oftentimes in running, our primary objective is not to reduce our speed.
Yeah, I agree.
So don't use poles
Unless you're going uphill.
unless you're going uphill, in which case you really need to practice with them in order to become more efficient. In a study I looked at, actually one of the best predictors of how much energy was saved while using poles, caveat, this test was done on a treadmill, was how much athletes trained with them. So train with them on the uphills if you plan to race with them, and also really practice those transitions as well so that you can be efficient and practice fueling while using poles.
Nice.
Yeah. All right.
Do we have more of these? I like this.
One last athlete question.
Okay.
All right.
Bring it on.
I'm curious to know how to know where to start for miles per week. I feel like I could do 25% more, but everything online says not to increase more than 10%. How do you know where to begin without injuries happening? Also, what do typical deload periods look like? How often and how do you go about it?
Oh, man. Hire a coach.
Yeah, definitely hire a coach. But I think this goes back to something that you often hear in, like, really beginnery runner spaces, which is the 10% rule,
Right.
which says to not increase your training load by more than 10% each week, which is a generally pretty good guideline for beginner runners, but is totally irrelevant for well-trained athletes. Your ramp rate is one of the bigger predictors of injury risks. So you don't want to increase your, likely you don't want to increase your load by, 40% week over week. But more experienced athletes, like, you can go from, recovering from, just thinking of my training specifically, after I raced the Silver Rush 50, obviously I did a down week, so I had just raced 50 miles, so I did maybe 20 miles, and then I peaked at 86 miles the week after.
Yeah.
I'm not a math whiz, but 23 to 86 is a significant increase.
I think that's more than 10%.
It's more than 10%.
I have to check my math.
But those things are okay if you have the training history to back it up.
Right.
So we don't want athletes to there is no like magic formula for this. And I think that experienced athletes need to let go of the 10% number, because that also fails to account for what intensity you're doing. It also fails to account for how much vert you're doing in training. 10% is like, it's a way oversimplification of the many factors that go into determining what your training stress actually is.
Yeah, and I would say for this athlete, I would think about increasing, if you want to increase beyond 10%, if you're more of a beginner, which, likely you are just by nature of this kind of question, think about just increasing one variable.
Yeah.
And if you're feeling very good and you think you could increase by 25%, maybe split that in half just to be a bit safer. Remember that structural adaptations take longer to create than aerobic adaptations. So although you might be feeling aerobically quite strong, we don't actually know. And there are some ways you can judge this, like how you're recovering between runs would be a good indication of structural adaptation. But we don't necessarily have like as hard of evidence as how those systems are working. So maybe just split that number in half and go up to 12.5%. And just, you could think about increasing that across all of your runs to balance the stress would be a very safe approach, or maybe in 2 runs. But I would think about just probably increasing just the volume of very easy running first. If you're doing speed work or anything like that, probably leave that the same or reduce that in order to compensate for increasing. And if you do really want to go to a 25% increase, I would probably remove all intensity from the training just to be safe. Because again, we don't know exactly how those structural systems are going. And, I haven't been monitoring your training.
Yeah.
So I don't know exactly how you're going to
Exactly.
feel and what your pre-existing stress balance looks like in training. Are you doing 5 runs a week? Are you doing 3? So, all things to consider. I would consider, if you're only doing 3 runs a week to, increase that overall percentage of easy running by adding 2 more shorter easy days on, so you get to 5 days a week, and then thinking about distributing stress over 5 days, which is going to make those runs a lot more manageable. The other thing is these deload weeks. Looks different for every athlete. I don't think that there's really a number you can put on this. Again, a deload week for an experienced athlete could look at leaving all volume the same and reducing just intensity. It could also look at reducing a significant 20 to 40% of volume and leaving intensity, or decreasing both in some way, depending on whether you're, using a hybrid training approach or not. So, tough to say. I would say listen to your body, see what you need, reduce the intensity probably first more than anything, because that's the stuff that's going to be hardest on your joints, hardest to recover from. If that doesn't feel like enough to, feel well recovered, then, consider reducing your volume too.
Yeah. I think that's, again, like, this is why it's so important to work with a coach, is because all of this is so dependent on your health and athletic history as well. How much training have you been able to sustain for the past 5 to 10 years? What are your injury risks? What are your bone health risks? What are your soft tissue risks? And that's why it's so important to work with a coach. There was a really interesting study that came out a few years ago that looked at the difference in the efficacy in structuring in down weeks every 4 to 6 weeks, intentionally, versus whenever an athlete felt tired or life stuff came up and they took an unplanned down week. And actually the people who progressed the most over time were people who didn't have planned down weeks, but took them whenever it felt right or made sense for their life. And I actually really like that approach, because oftentimes the universe is going to gift us down weeks, right?
Yep.
Like you might feel tired, you have travel coming up, your kid's got a soccer tournament, whatever it is. Obviously, we don't want to get to the point where we're never taking down weeks. That's one reason I do like athletes to race as well, is because racing can help us structure in concentrated time, reduced training time as well. And I think that this can also be borne out as if you plan to take a down week every 4 to 6 weeks, oftentimes the universe is still going to gift you a down week anyway, so you end up taking more down weeks over time and you sustain less training load. Obviously, all of this is really dependent on the individual, and I always work really closely with my clients one-on-one to determine what approach is best for them. But I do think that that's an interesting wrinkle to the down week.
I mean, I would, if you're a newer athlete, listen to your body. Your body's often going to tell you when you need that down week. Are you struggling to recover? Do you feel out of breath going upstairs? Is your sleep disrupted? Are you overly sore?
Right.
Do you have little niggles popping up, like my Achilles is bothering me, or my shins hurt, or, my knees are feeling, sore or tight? Those are indications for all athletes of all levels, but especially typical stuff for beginners. If those things are feeling sore, take some rest days, take some down days, take some very easy days, reduce your training.
Yeah. All right. Time for partner race swap.
Okay, Zoe, it's almost Leadville week.
Woohoo.
4 weeks, 3 weeks? 3 weeks.
Yeah.
You just had a race, then you took a week to rest, and then you rocked like 80 something miles of training, 2 really big back-to-back long runs. Is best to your knowledge, why are you training this way? Why did you concentrate things that way? Why are you peaking at this point of the build in this point of the I guess the training build? Why 4 and 3 weeks out? These are your last 2 big weeks. Why? How do you feel?
Right. Well, I feel great, which is amazing. And again, like, this is because I've been training consistently for 6 years at this point that I'm able to do this. So that's a tip for everyone out there, is just train for longer. And that really increases your ability to do all the things. But I raced the Silver Rush 50, which was sort of my like B race to get ready for Leadville, because it's at a similar altitude on similar terrain, and 50 miles is a good sort of distance to target building up to a 100. But obviously I took some really concerted time off after it in order to adapt to the stimulus. Then this past week I did 86 miles with 18,000 feet of climbing, really trying to target similar terrain that I would experience in Leadville. So I did my key long run of this build on Hope Pass, which is a really sort of specific part of the Leadville course, where it's 67,000 feet of climbing in the course of like 25 miles. And I really wanted to do that specifically so that I could get my quads used to the eccentric loading of running downhill, particularly on steep technical trails. So that's really the most specific Leadville training I've done. I did go out and do a boot camp in Leadville earlier this summer, but it was during when there was a fire on near Hope Pass, so I wasn't able to target that specific part of the course. And I think that part of the course is the most important to preview before race day at Leadville, because it is really specific. The Leadville course is interesting because it's fairly flat with this big mountain pass right in the middle. So my goal was really to go bang up my quads and then still maintain good turnover and high output after. So I ran Hope Pass on Saturday, and then I did a sort of like mountain adventure on Sunday, really trying to target like a mini, I sort of like in my head did like a mini Leadville. So primarily not super technical, not super steep, grindy BLM road.
Yeah.
And then I did a little out and back to an alpine lake to practice power hiking and then descending on steep technical alpine trail at high altitude, and then finished with 10 miles at steady state effort on, again, fairly race similar terrain, being non-technical, sort of grindy BLM high altitude trail. So
yeah, nice.
I wanted to make my legs nice and sore and practice toggling between effort levels and making sure that I could go, sort of like, all right, climb up to something, descend down well, and then maintain high turnover after. So that was my goal. And then also just eating, really practicing eating, really practicing recovering after, I did Hope Pass. I really just chilled on the couch, really focused on getting in high quality nutrition, tons of protein for soft tissue recovery, and making sure I got a good night's sleep and stayed off my feet between my back-to-back long runs.
What do you think about in terms of mental training for these days? Now, I hear a lot about the physiology and the race-specific terrain, but are you also kind of visualizing what this would be like on race day and what you'll be telling yourself, how you'll be motivating yourself? It sounds like a lot of your training right now is kind of playing towards that very cruxy part dead in the middle of the race, which is Hope Pass, which is, typically where, I've had people tell me, like, when I was racing this is like, this is not where you will win the race.
Yeah.
But this is definitely where you can lose the race.
Yeah, this is often the case with, like, big climbs that people get really, like, kind of overthink in trail races. Like, we had a bunch of athletes just do Never Summer, and the North Diamond climb is a big part of that race. And you can really only make up so much time there, but you can definitely lose a ton. So I think it's important to, like you said, approach it from a perspective of you are unlikely to win the race here, but you could lose it. So it's less about trying to be really, really strong and like dominate a climb than it is about assessing and addressing any weaknesses. And again, thinking about the principle of we want to train more specific things closer to the race and less specific things further away. Zooming out to look at my training over the course of the year, I've been training my speed and running economy, 360 days a year or whatever, like however many days I train, plus doubles and whatnot. So I've been working on that running economy. So that's not my focus in the, 3-4 weeks leading up to this event. I'm focused on the specific adaptations I need, which is musculoskeletal durability and technical downhill ability and altitude. I'll also say I'm not spending a ton of time at altitude very close to the race because I want to prioritize health and recovery over, altitude particularly.
Yeah.
So that's one reason that we drove over to Hope Pass for the day. I could have spent the night at altitude, but I actually think it was more impactful and beneficial for me to sleep in my own bed at my elevation.
Yeah. And
for better recovery.
Well, just, didn't we just do a podcast on altitude?
Yes.
We talked about how that wouldn't have done anything. It would have just overstressed you.
It would have just been a shitty night's sleep for nothing.
And so worse recovery.
Yeah.
Well, great work. It sounds like things are going really well, and you've got one more big week ahead of you.
Yeah, and I think, something that was really important talking about the back-to-back recoveries, when I started my Sunday run, the second long run, I felt like hot garbage. It started directly uphill, and I felt so slow and so tired, and it was sort of a mental struggle, but I was just like, all right, keep your head down, keep grinding, and practice that fueling. And I ended up, I wrote on my Strava that I started the run feeling like, oh my God, it's so over. And I ended the run feeling like, we are so back, baby. And I think that that is also an important thing to experience in training that we don't often get to experience because we want our training to feel pretty good most of the time. Like if you're having a lot of highly emotional conversations with yourself where you're journeying to the center of who you are in training, you might be doing a little too much, but we do want to maybe do that once or twice going into a big race.
Yeah.
And so that was my opportunity to physically experience the fact that you can feel bad at one point and then feel better later.
Right. I think it is good that you experience that now. You want to kind of pack that into your memory here and think about that over the next couple of weeks as you're building your self-efficacy for the event. That belief in your ability to do things that are difficult, it comes specifically from the trials that are experienced in training. And so if you're not pushing yourself and experiencing that, if every run in training feels like $1 million, likely, you get to the race. And I just don't know any athlete who's experienced any race at any level who's actually been pushing themselves that it was just, freaking rainbows and unicorns the whole time. I mean,
Yeah.
there's always a point, especially in the longer stuff, there's always a point where you have to really make that choice to stay in it.
Correct.
And so if you haven't experienced that in training, it's going to feel unfamiliar during the race, and likely you're going to struggle with that choice then. So I think that was really good timing for you. You don't need to do that within the 2 weeks before your race, but maybe between week 5 and 3 out is a good moment for that.
You want to maximize how much rainbows and unicorns in your taper.
Yes.
Yeah.
Nice.
Cool.
Well,
So,
great job.
TJ, you have, you've been recovering from Western states, and I think it's also given you the opportunity to take a step back and look at your training and your approach long term, and you have actually switched coaches, which is pretty big news for you.
Yeah, it's huge news because I know everybody who is my athlete, everybody who's on my athlete roster, and anybody who's listened to this podcast long term has, knows my approach when working with a coach. In my view, that one, don't fix something that's not broken.
Right.
Two, if you're improving over time, likely things are working. Don't see point one.
Yeah.
Don't try to fix it if it's not broken. But I've spent a lot of time reviewing over 6.5 years, approaching 7 years of training. I was with David Roche, an amazing person, amazing coach. Actually, it was a life-changing relationship for me, and it's actually kind of tough to talk about, to be honest, because David and I have a lot of history, almost 7 years working together. I've personally never worked with an athlete for 7 years. So as a coach,
You've been with David longer than you've been with me.
Yeah. It's wild to think about. I mean, that's a lot of training history, but there were some things that I've been thinking about, long term.
What you wanted from a coach has changed partially because of the work you do with your athletes.
Yeah, I mean, that was the biggest motivator for me in switching my coaching, my personal coaching, right? Is that the right way to say it? Switching the coach that I work with.
The service you were rendering for other people made you realize you wanted something different for yourself.
Yeah, totally. Well, I think like when at Microcosm we restructured our business, complete overhaul back in November, and that was almost a year's worth of work and research on what the current best practices are, modeled by the best coaches in the industry, the people that we really look up to, and that's who I aspire to be as a coach. I aspire to be somebody that is amongst the best, a thought leader, somebody who is really a game changer with their athletes, fully present in that process. And I think, reviewing, what we've done to structure our business differently to elevate the quality of service, I think part of that was maybe me projecting what I needed as an athlete or thought I needed. And so it's taken me a long time to come to terms with that because I'm like, well, I'm still getting better. So why make a change? And it's not the quality of the plan that made me want to change. It was the way that the plan was conveyed and delivered and the communication and interactions that made me change.
Right. So I think this is a really important point, and this is something that I take a lot of pride and joy in not working with every client. My goal is to actually have a solid percentage of people that I do a consultation call with, and at the end of the call say, I'm not sure we're a fit. And that's because I have confidence in my coaching and in our programming that I don't need to be everything to everyone. I need to be the thing for a few people. And I think that doesn't mean that other coaches are better, or I'm worse, or I'm better and they're worse. Every person is going to want something different out of coaching, and that's good. That's okay. We all have different needs, and we all, even if the training plan doesn't vary hugely from coach to coach, it's totally good and normal to assess what your needs are and learn how to ask for them and advocate for them in a coach-athlete relationship. So I always take pride in, I wouldn't say turning people down, but again, getting to the end of a consultation call and saying actually, I think you need something beyond what I offer, and that's how people can really know and trust me when I say, actually, I think we're a good fit.
Sure, sure.
Is from a place of confidence and belief in the thing that matters most is that connection, is that relationship.
Well, I mean, the coaching relationship is a two-way street.
Correct.
There are specific deliverables that the athlete has to be held accountable to, and there's specific deliverables that the coach must be accountable to, and those agreements must be explicit. They must be written down in a contract that both people, are reviewing.
Or
and
that's
are on the
our
same...
belief. A lot of people don't do this. That's our belief.
Fundamentally my belief.
Yeah.
As a coach who's done this professionally for nearly 7 years now, if things are not explicit, it erodes trust. And trust is the most important. It is the bedrock of the coach-athlete relationship. You can't have a functional environment for the athlete to work with the coach in if there isn't trust. And so both people need to know what they're coming to the table for. Every coach is, every business owner is entitled to run their business the way they want. And, I'm going to run my business based on the best possible, best practices that I see in the industry.
How did you go about assessing who would be a good match for you? Like, what questions do you ask when you're looking for a coach?
Well, I think first of all, it comes down to explicit agreements around deliverables. What are the deliverables that I, as an athlete, am looking for? I'm looking to talk to my coach for about 30 to 60 minutes a month, whether it's on the phone or on a video call. I want to have verbal communication. That's just something that in 7 years I didn't have. And that's something that I give my athletes and really, truly believe in. I think that is the bedrock of what I can deliver as a coach, is what happens in those deep dive calls. And so having in other areas like in executive coaching and holistic health coaching gotten to do those calls and also received coaching through those calls, I know that they're powerful for me and can make a difference. So I look for a coach who wanted to deliver on something similar to that. Also, a coach who wants to look through the data files and is going to use technology to assist them in that. So getting out of Google spreadsheets was a huge thing for me. I love the vibes and I love subjective feedback, and I really like getting that stuff from my athletes because 90% of the time that dictates what I do as a coach. But everything should be backed up by data. There should always be a way to analyze data. I picked a coach who wanted to do that, and that was part of what they wanted to deliver, and who could give actionable feedback based on those things and offer other perspective. And I looked for a coach specifically who can hold me accountable to excellence. So
what does that look like for you?
Well, they have to have been in the arena. They have to be out there pursuing goals at a high level, working towards excellence in their own life, so that they know what that feels like. I can only trust people to help me get to the next level who have experienced that themselves and are actively experiencing that. So I sought out a coach who had those credentials. They have race experience for many, many years and are actively training and pursuing those things. And then, delivering on that accountability, I don't want a cheerleader. That's me. Sometimes I'm a cheerleader for my athletes, and I love to pivot between that and accountability. But specifically for me, I just don't respond that great to cheerleading. I respond better to, let's do this. Here's what we need. Here's how to execute. Here's how to get to the next level. Right.
Well, I think, again, that comes back to the point that, there's not necessarily a right and a wrong way. And within a certain,
totally.
There's some things you really can't do and really some things you should do. Give a plan, give feedback. But what any specific athlete needs and what any specific coach is willing to give is going to vary relationship to relationship. And again, that doesn't mean one coach is better than the other. It means that there's going to be a coach-athlete relationship that's better for you than others.
Well, and I think what I really hear you saying is that each coach out there in the space has their own individual skill set. And
Correct.
A good coach should be very aware of what their skills are and maybe where they don't want to operate. Like you said, I can't be a great coach to everyone, and I hold that as a truth for me in my coaching practice. And so like when having, discussions with, other coaches about, best fit, one, are we values aligned? Two, is this, somebody who isn't going to try to mold themselves into the coach that I want? Is it somebody who just is in their being, their natural state, that coach?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think this is something that is extremely important for any coaches out there who listen to this call. Don't be a coach for everyone.
Right.
Be a coach.
If you're a coach for everyone, you're doing it wrong.
Right. Be a coach for the people that you are values aligned with.
Yeah.
You don't have to hit the mark on every single value, but the core values, really there should be a lot of overlap, because again, foundation of coach-athlete relationship, both people need to feel as though they can express themselves in the relationship, the coach and the athlete. And one way to create space and to nurture that environment is through commonality.
Yeah.
So it's really, really key to have that. And I think that was a very difficult thing for me in changing coaches, because like with working with David, we were very values aligned on a lot of things, but on some stuff over time, my values changed a little bit. And so like you can start somewhere, and then over time, everyone changes, right? So like we should be growing and changing. And I think, ultimately, like in reflecting, like David helped me get to a place where then I could, recognize, the changes that I've made, and then work with somebody else who can help me then harness those changes and to reach, new levels in my training. And so like, ultimately it's a very positive thing, I think, at this moment for everyone to like make the change, even though that it's hard. And it's not, I keep hearing from you and that like, oh, it's not about a good coach or a bad coach. And it's like, it's
about the good coach for you.
Right. It's about just finding the right coach. And there's a lot of coaches out there. And something was really important to me in making this coaching change. And like, just to be honest, it's funny. I hired a CTS coach, Cliff Pittman, who
shout out to Cliff.
Yeah, shout out to Cliff, friend of Microcosm, who has been really supportive of what we do and really helped model professionalism in the coaching space. And to be honest, did play a modeling role in like how we restructured our business in many ways, looking at what they do and what he does with the coaches that he coaches.
Because he's a coach of coaches.
Yeah, and I love that.
Which
and
you are as well, yeah.
But, I think the main point that I was trying to get at with that is, like, it's really, I think it's interesting to see where you can start and then where you end up.
Right.
And leaving yourself open to that. But with any relationship, it involves a serious time commitment to work with somebody new. And so, one of the explicit things that, I agreed on with Cliff was a long-term relationship to build the relationship.
Yeah. And
so, my relationship with David, almost 7 years, didn't just become a effective and game-changing relationship for me overnight. It was something that, I committed to 3 to 5 years with him. That was my commitment. When I started working with him, and we went much further than that, which is awesome,
amazing,
super cool. And so like I'm really committed to similar timescales because it takes that long to get to know. We both get to know each other in the process. And it's super exciting.
Yeah. Something that whenever I'm having an initial call with clients, something I always ask is, what are you looking for out of a coach? And I think that's one of the most important things to discuss with an athlete, because it can help educate how if we do decide to work together, that can really help me understand how to show up for them. B, I think it's the most telling question in assessing, is this client a good fit for me? Because if someone is looking for a lot of times people's expectations about what a coach can be, it needs to be properly calibrated, right? Like if I have a call with someone and they're like, I expect you to text me first thing every single morning and respond to every email within 10 minutes, and also program strength training, also do meal planning for me, also communicate with my husband for me, also give me marital advice, which like all of these are things that I have had athletes ask from me. Sure. Like, dead ass, all of those things have happened. Those are important things for me to either say, is this really something you need? If so, let's find you a different resource. Or like, here's what I'm willing to offer, maybe within the context of our coaching. Like, we do have a mental performance expert. We do have a therapist. We do have a nutritionist. We do have a strength coach. Like, are you willing to truly build out your network? But if you're looking for someone to be your mommy, your nutritionist, your husband, and your strength coach, it ain't me.
There's somebody out there for you, but it won't be
I'm
at
sure,
Microcosm.
and good luck paying $900 a month for all of those services baked into one.
Oh, it's going to be a lot more than $900 a month if
true.
that person who's delivering on that is smart at all.
Yeah, but I think that, again, like, it's all about the relationship, and that's the biggest thing to look for. And just, it's good to shop around. It's good to ask hard questions. Yep. I always want, we always have ongoing conversations with our athletes. What feedback do you have for me? How can I learn and do better? And I would always look for a coach who's trying to, yes, stay up on the research, but who is also trying to improve in their relationship as well.
Well, that's because, oh man, I would love to just talk about this for hours, but already we're 50 minutes into the podcast. And I think, again, the bedrock of all of this is the coach-athlete relationship, and it rests on trust. There are many things that coaches get wrong. I have done this as a coach that erode trust. Not having explicit agreements erodes trust. Not showing up on time or delivering on what you say you're going to deliver on erodes trust. I could just go through this, but those things might seem little or start as little things. But if they're repeated, what ends up being called into question is the validity of the plan.
Right.
And then when you don't believe in the work that you're doing, we all know that you're going to get less value out of that work. And so, something that I was really explicit with Cliff about is, here's what I expect.
Yeah.
And if you can't deliver on these things,
tell me now.
We're not a good match.
Yeah.
And so I love to come forward with that. That's something that the athletes that I work with and go through onboarding with us, specifically those who in the last maybe 18 months as we've continued to shape up our agreements and how explicit we are with our expectations of ourselves and the clients that we have, it really starts to build in that implicit trust that just has to be there for the coach-athlete relationship to function at the very basic level.
Absolutely. All right. We wanted to chat through the six biggest training mistakes that athletes make. What is the number one training mistake, TJ, that you see athletes make?
Number one?
Yeah.
All right.
Well, this is not in order of importance.
In order of importance, number one. I'll start with not knowing your why or not having a vision, a long-term vision for what you want to create.
Would you say that's the most important? That's the biggest mistake. That's mistake number one, the most important.
Well, you said I didn't have to say it was number one, right?
But you said it as if it is.
I do. I think it's fundamental.
Yeah.
That's my bias. Okay. I admit. I'm not unbiased on this.
So tell me why it's important for athletes to know their why.
If you don't know why you're doing this, and you don't know what you're trying to create, you have nothing to connect your thoughts, words, and actions to.
Yeah.
So when you're trying to run easier, when you're trying to implement speed work, when you're trying to work on your fueling, when you're trying to stay consistent, none of that is tethered to anything. So it makes no sense, and it's much harder to implement those other principles.
Right. Yeah, I think knowing your why is just fundamental because it makes doing all the things, I wouldn't say easier, but it gives them purpose. And a lot of times we'll have athletes say, oh, I'm struggling with motivation. I don't believe in motivation. I believe in knowing your why and then understanding how each thing that you do every single day connects to your why. For me, one of my whys is excellence. So knowing that, I'm able to connect, even if it's something like doing my 2 minutes of clamshells or like doing my 2 minutes of resistance bands. That becomes much easier to prioritize when it's connected to my why of excellence.
Yeah.
It makes like getting, the amount of protein that I need to get in a day makes that easier. It makes all of those things make sense. If you're just like, if you're saying, oh, I need to get this much protein in because I need to get this much protein in, not going to be enough. And that's where you're going to start to feel, that's when you're going to start to make decisions based on motivation, which is always the wrong place to make decisions from, because motivation is a feeling and commitment is a way of being. And knowing your why will help you stay committed when motivation wanes.
Right? Like, I feel like when you have like I need to get 150 grams of protein in a day. It's such a great example because so many athletes need to work on their fueling, right? Yeah. Whether it's in run or in life. Oh, it's 150 grams. Great. So, what kind of committed action are you going to take? Well, I'm running the Leadville 100 in 6 months.
Yes.
And I'm really in my training now. And so in order to recover, I must take in 150 grams of protein a day. So I've immediately connected the action, like this new habit I want to start, this action with the outcome, which is recovering well, which is a short-term outcome connected to a long-term outcome, which is the race. This is a very strong combination of short and long-term goals that goes beyond just like, do I feel excited to do this?
Right. I think so often we see athletes not struggle with doing the big things. Athletes will hit the long runs. They'll do the big, sexy workouts. They'll hit the vert, and like all of that's great. Where we see people struggle is like getting their 5-mile run in around town, eating that 300-calorie or like eating the breakfast that they need to eat, doing their mobility, doing their PT. They struggle with getting the easy things, and that's because they struggle to connect the easy things to their why. Whereas it feels like the more explicit things, like the workout in the long run, it feels easier mentally for them to understand what the why is. Oh, well, why am I doing my long run? Well, because I want to run an ultra or I want to run a marathon. However, those 5 miles that you do so many times in training, just as important. And making sure that you have a story about how that 5-mile run around town connects to your why is what's going to make all the difference in your training.
Absolutely. What's another principle? Another mistake.
I think going back to the fueling, a big mistake is not fueling well and not fueling strategically. Something I always want my athletes to think about is we eat to train, we don't train to eat, right? I think that a lot of times using training as a permission structure around food is really, really unhealthy. Training a lot is not quote unquote permission to eat a certain way. We want to eat well and we want to nourish our bodies, A, because everyone deserves that, and B, because it sustains the training. So a simple framework swap that I like my athletes to adopt is eat to train, don't train to eat. A lot of times that does empower us to make better decisions around our fueling. Secondarily, you need to, another thing I want athletes to think about is nail your fueling in life and practice it on runs.
And I love this because a mistake within this that I see athletes make is not fueling their long runs all the way to the end.
Right.
And so that actually puts you at greater risk for injury. It makes your recovery take longer.
Yeah.
So a mistake is not fueling well in life and in training. And then a sub mistake within that is athletes who gels are pretty expensive, so I'm not going to eat one with 30 minutes left in my run, or, I'm just, I know I was close to the finish, so I didn't continue to fuel. And I will tell you, every athlete that I have gotten to fix that mistake has taken their training to the next level.
Yeah.
It really makes a difference.
And just to iterate, because I feel like we need to iterate it every couple weeks, aim for 60 to 90 grams of carbohydrate per hour.
90 is the magic number.
And actually, we're seeing, particularly male athletes at the top of the sport push that.
Yeah.
You can get curious about pushing that, but Definitely you don't want to see athletes fueling, likely we don't want to see them eating less than 60 grams of carbohydrate an hour. And it's not going to feel perfect right off the bat, right? Like if you expect to just like first long run in your marathon training block be able to take in 90 grams of carbohydrate, these things all take trial and error, but the gut is a trainable system. And that's one of the first things that we start training when we work with athletes, is starting to get a baseline for like, okay, what are you eating and you're drinking on your runs? Let's really look at the nutritional content there. And then how do we increase that and what actually feels good for us? And again, these things like take time and they take practice to dial in, and you have to practice on every single long run.
All right, what else do we have on this list here?
The third mistake that I see athletes make in training is running too hard. What does this look like, TJ?
Means exactly what it means. Running too hard. You have an easy day and you're running moderate. You have a recovery day and you're running easy. You have a 1 hour effort pace threshold workout and you're doing it at 5K effort. It's just not adhering to the basic training framework that you have in terms of like respecting effort.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that, the principle here is easy days easy, hard days hard. And if you're not running your easy days easy enough, you're not going to be able to run your hard days hard enough. So we always want to work on growing the gap between our easy efforts and our high-end hard efforts. A lot of times when I see athletes who aren't able to push the hard in their training, that to me is demonstrative that they're probably not running easy enough.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they're always training at an intent. They're not ever able to recover from the intensity of their training. And because of that, they're never able to run hard enough to progress. So you sort of get stuck in a negative feedback loop of what I like to call gray zone running, of like, well, you're never running easy. You're never running hard. Maybe you're not even like, you're not able to add volume. You're not able to add intensity, but you're also never really able to recover either. Another mistake I see is not progressing your training over time. TJ, tell me why this is important.
Well, to get better, you need to do more over time.
Yep, it's actually that easy. You do just have to do more.
I think this is a hard thing for self-coached athletes to honestly self-assess. So hire a coach. We can help you do that by understanding the micro and macro cycles that you're going through in your training, and helping to assess, this is where you're at, this is where you want to go, here's how you can build competence, coach to that middle space so you can continue to get better. It's one of these things where if you've adapted to certain training stimulus, you just simply won't get better unless you're doing more work.
Yeah. If you are running 35 miles a week for 5 years, you're just not going to be able to get better. We have to change the stimulus so that your body can adapt and change. And again, this is really hard to do strategically unless you have that objective third party who's able to look at the data, who's able to talk with you about how certain training loads and how certain stimuli feel, because some athletes can handle those bigger increases in volume or intensity compared to other athletes. And maybe this is something where athletes who are volume or stress limited, we can incorporate cross training. We can use strength training to improve, but you can't continue to do the same thing week over week, month over month, year over year, and expect to get better.
Yeah.
All
How
right.
about consistency?
Consistency is one, and this is something I know we harp on all the time. We're consistent in our love of consistency. But training, what's important to understand is that training adaptations take place in micro and macro cycles, which generally spans months and even years. Everyone adapts at their own pace. Whatever context you're bringing to the training is going to really impact this. If you have a deep athletic history, your adaptations are going to look different. If you're newer, those timelines look different. And just like depending on your individual physiology, it's going to look different. And this is why we really discourage athletes taking huge breaks. We do after big events, after a big season, we do want to take a structured down period, but we definitely recommend against huge off seasons where you're taking 3-4 weeks or months off without a necessity, essentially. Because that's going to be your number one limiting factor in progressing that training. So a lot of these things all work hand in hand, but consistency is just one of the most important things that you can do in your training.
Absolutely. How about speed? We didn't touch on speed yet.
Speed, this is a big one.
Number 6.
I feel like this is one of the biggest changes when we have a new athlete who comes to work with us. One of the first things we'll do is implement intensity, especially with folks who have like maybe been, I feel like this is particularly common in trail runners. Usually marathoners have been doing some amount of speed work, which is another reason we love to work with marathoners, is we get to just be a little bit more intentional and we can be more structured in their speed work. But for trail and ultra runners, a lot of times we have people come in and they've just never done speed work and they're frustrated because they're not getting any faster. Speed work is essential for progressing your training.
Absolutely. If you're not doing speed, don't expect to get better.
Yeah, it's the only way you can improve. Like, it helps raise your ceiling and then it helps raise your floor as well. It will make you more efficient. It will make you more durable. It will improve your biomechanics. It will improve your energy systems. If you're not doing some sort of structured speed work, your training is like way less effective than it would be otherwise. Some people might be able to reach some amount of like, they might be able to, yes, improve over time if all you ever do is easy aerobic volume, but you're not going to improve as quickly and as consistently as if you were intentionally structuring in some intensity. Intensity will make it's bigger bang for your buck.
Yeah. Well, thanks guys. Hope you enjoyed this podcast. A lot of information in here. But if you have a question for a future call, a little coach's corner action like we did in the beginning, microcosmcoaching@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. And you can also check us out on the web if you're interested in coaching at microcosm-coaching.com. All right. See you soon.